Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I also serve as the director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights, which hosts the Race and Rights Podcast. The Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu. And if you find this podcast informative, support CSRR by pressing the donate button, and please give generously. In today's episode, I speak with Professor Bassam Haddad about the origins of Syria's uprising in 2011 that culminated in the historic overthrow of the Assad regime in 2024 and the current uncertainty of Syria's position in regional politics. Professor Bassam Haddad is founding director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program and associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He is the author of the book, Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2011. And he is also co-editor of the book, A Critical Political Economy of the Middle East. Professor Haddad is co-founder and editor of Jadaliyya-e-Zain and the executive director of the Arab Studies Institute. He serves as founding editor of the Arab Studies Journal and the Knowledge Production Project. And Professor Haddad is also co-producer and director of the award-winning documentary film About Baghdad. And he is also the director of the acclaimed series of Arabs and Terrorism. Currently, Professor Haddad is working on his second book entitled Understanding the Syrian Calamity, Regime, Opposition, and Outsiders, forthcoming with Stanford University Press. Now, in this episode, Professor Haddad explains Syria's complex history and politics that ultimately led to the historic overthrow of Bashar Al Assad on December 8, 2024, as unexpected as the Arab Spring revolutions that gripped the Middle East 13 years earlier. Located at the center of regional competition, the nation of Syria will continue to experience foreign intervention from its neighbors as well as the United States. And meanwhile, millions of Syrian refugees outside the country are gradually returning to rebuild their homeland. So let's hear what our guest has to say about U.S. policy in Syria and what lies ahead for the Syrian people, who yearn for self-governance, peace, and security.
Thank you, Sahar, for hosting me. I'm delighted to be here and honored. I've been following your work, and all I have to say is all power to you. We all appreciate your insights and energy.
Thank you, Bassam. I'm just trying to keep up with you. Let's start by giving our audience kind of an overview of why the Syrian uprising took place in 2011. And let me just add the caveat that we could have an entire series of episodes about the rich history and complicated politics of the nation of Syria, especially within the regional context, which unfortunately is not what we're going to be doing today. So we are intentionally focusing on 2011 until the present day, and also with an eye towards U.S. foreign policy under the new Trump administration with regard to Syria and the Middle East. So tell our listeners, from your perspective, based on your expertise, why did the Syrian uprising take place in 2011?
That's a great starting point. And unfortunately, so many conversations take place about Syria as if everything started in November 2024. But I'll also be brief because I know that we have a big agenda. I'll just simply say that the uprising in Syria, just like any uprising elsewhere, is a composite of several factors that developed over time. Still, in my view, no mass protests in Syria could have taken place without the domino effect, which was started by the decapitation of the head of state and the removal and, their exit in Tunisia and Egypt successively, without which I don't think Syrians would have ventured into or were ready to venture in terms of the risk analysis that, governed what they did prior to December 2010 January 2011, when the uprisings started, they wouldn't have ventured into the streets en masse everywhere, almost everywhere in Syria. Now, very quickly, because we could get bogged down in the details, I do not approach this from a hard causality perspective where X, Y produced A and B. But historically, I mean, there are proximate causes, which I discussed, have to do with the domino effect, which kind of galvanized Syrians at a moment where their consciousness were unified, or their awareness about the prospects were unified, and the calculus of going to the streets seemed to be advantageous, as opposed to, say, 2 months before, where going to the street could have just resulted in that group being arrested, disappeared, killed, and what have you. At the time, at least, there was an awareness that everyone is aware of the broader context and might actually follow suit. And of course, there is a pretext that was discussed in terms of the proximate causes, with the kids drawing on the walls that, the regime must fall. This story is both real and not clear, right? Something happened. We don't know what happened, but it instigated basically the first protests, which were then met with serious brutality ultimately after a couple of these iterations. And then, of course, things were sparked. Now, these are the proximate causes, and the event that ignited the mass protests, at least in Dir'a in the south, which is actually, interestingly, in all uprisings, including Egypt, as you know, as well as Tunisia, the protests did not start in Egypt, for instance, in Tahrir Square. They started elsewhere, outside the capital city, and then moved to the capital city, which is very instructive. And we can discuss this at a later time. But historically, the Syrian state and the composite of factors include political repression, which was relatively constant, even if at certain points the brutality was sort of beyond the charts, such as the Hama massacre and just a couple of other incidents that are globally known to be, markers of brutality, but also the constant fear that people lived under, which is one of the reasons why today every Syrian, or most Syrians, or the overwhelming majority, are happy that this is behind them. Whatever else might come next, we will talk about that. It's not as rosy as people might think, but we'll get to it. In all cases, the political repression combined ultimately with a neoliberalization that has taken place in Syria under Hafez Assad Sr., starting in the late 80s, early 1990s, and then accelerating under Bashar in the 2000s, created the kind of social polarization that began to began to break down, because in the 90s, the kind of leveling egalitarianism that I used to describe Syria, whereby everyone is equally repressed in the 80s. In the 1990s, you began to see these distinctions between different social groups, including those who are not social groups that are either connected to the state or part of the state on the one hand, and the others. But then under Bashar, these fissures began to become so extant and so dramatic that the idea that we are repressed politically, but economically we could make ends meet and we're all in this together fell apart. The leveling egalitarianism fell apart. So throughout the 2000s under Bashar, the increasing social polarization was simply waiting almost for some sort of event or some sort of dissent that would actually potentially spark a movement. No one predicted that it was going to happen in December 2010 when Bouazizi immolated himself. And then, of course, the other events followed suit. But in Syria, as a result of this social polarization, the growing mass discontent, things that I'm not going to detail, but including the drought that hit Syria in the 2000s, that actually further degraded everything that was taking place in the countryside and created more of a miserable situation there, which is in part why the uprisings started outside the metropolitan cities. And because of the continuing policies that benefited a sliver of the population at the expense of the rest, within the rubric supposedly of some sort of egalitarian economy and society, as well as the removal of subsidies that actually supported, those who actually needed that support from a quote-unquote welfare state. The gradual removal of subsidies ultimately led to the removal of subsidies on oil, which ended up making everything even more expensive. And by the late 2000s, as a result of all these factors, always undergirded by stark, severe mismanagement and corruption, although, corruption is sort of an effect. It's not a cause. A lot of people talk about corruption as if corruption produces X. No, corruption is an effect of problematic, unaccountable rule and repression and so on. In all cases, that set the stage for a situation where, yes, it could be ignited, but it wasn't ready to be ignitable internally without any external sort of stimulus. And the evidence is there's no need for evidence. Just a month before Bouazizi immolated himself, you would walk around Syrian cities and towns, and it seems, nothing was happening basically as a result of concern about reprisal and so on, but nothing was really happening. In all cases, those composite factors, to be very crude actually, ended up creating the if you will, the stack of hay, which was really huge, accumulated over the decades, that just needed to be ignited. And this was ignited through the protests in Dar'a in response to a narrative about children writing on the wall, calling for the regime's overthrow, and so on. And this is the background. In other words, there is ample reason for the Syrian people, as I have argued for actually even before the uprising. I was writing immediately before the uprising, finishing my book, and I end my book with like a narrative about how if things don't change, Syria is sort of like a ticking bomb, not in so many words, but very much so, but still never considered that the upheaval would be as proximate. So there are many reasons for Syrians to go to the streets. And I say this because when I was writing about these matters and when the uprising took place, of course, the discourse on Syria is toxic. I'm not going to get into it because they could take up most of the time and for no good reason. But a lot of people would say that this is an externally instigated event, that basically it's an imperial colonial plot and so on and so forth. Of course, there's imperialism, and of course there are schemes and designs to undermine, for instance, resistance in the region, resistance to imperialism and so on. But the reasons why Syrians went to the street have nothing to do with that factor, even if ultimately and later, as I may discuss, that ended up playing a role. There are plenty of reasons for Syrians to rebel, and it's insulting to say that this is an externally imposed plot. And this caused for me, in terms of discursively speaking, and for many others like myself who supported the idea of a major overhaul in Syria, this caused us to be, critiqued and even dismissed by people who believe that this is an externally designed plot.
Well, and that brings me to another point that there was quite a bit of debate about, and it was often debated in the context of trying to figure out why did Syria fail as opposed to Tunisia and arguably Egypt, which at least initially people thought were quote unquote successful uprisings or successful revolutions. And that's the regional and perhaps international politics, right? During both the 2011 to 2014, but even beyond, right? Until 2024. Syria is a very in a sensitive position, right, in between Israel and Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq. It has all of its neighbors, perhaps with the exception of Jordan, are key players, and oftentimes areas where there's quite a bit of conflict and foreign intervention in ways that causes wars and physical violence, often state violence, and then non-state violence in response. So can you give our listeners a perspective of what is that role of the regional politics of other Middle East countries, and of course, Russia? People can't talk about Syria without talking about Russia. How did that play into what ultimately transpired over the last 14 years?
In my view, this is the most important discussion point. Basically, what happened after the uprising emerged and how that set the stage to the current moment of the removal of the regime. Actually, not even the removal of the regime. The regime just disappeared, just withered, precisely by the actions of the president, who just basically boarded a plane and took off without even telling his close aides at some point, at some level. Now, these dynamics of the uprisings are important because, and it actually sets distinguishes between Syria and some of the other states, including Egypt and Tunisia. I don't think we could actually grapple or grasp the situation in Syria without recognizing that Syria has historically been a pivotal state in the Eastern Mediterranean, and not to say like entire Middle East or, in the developing world. Syria has always been a pivotal state. First, it was basically a pawn in the hands of bigger states like Egypt and Saudi Arabia in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and Iraq actually at the time. And then, of course, Hafiz Assad kind of like created a state that is far more independent and was able itself to influence regional politics. And now we're back after the collapse of the regime to a situation where others are actually trying to, jockey for position to control what's happening in Syria, including, of course, Turkey, but others as well. So we have come full circle anyway. Now, within that full circle, the period after Hafiz Assad Sr.'s reign, it is a reign. It's like almost family rule. I mean, it is family rule at some level. We have the Bashar years, which began to sort of undo some of what took place, what was built in the 70s and 80s, regardless of our positive or negative approach to it. I mean, it was repressive, but it also created some sort of like egalitarianism, some sort of welfare state supports that provided people with the minimum, which began to degrade through neoliberalism of the Syrian regime itself. Interestingly, a lot of people must know that even socialist regime engage in that. And then, of course, that started under Assad in the late 80s and early 90s and continued under Bashar and was accelerated. Now, after the uprising started, this pivotal state in Syria is the reason why people wanted, on the one hand, to support the state, not necessarily the regime itself, Bashar and so on, but the state that was ruled by these people and by this regime. And on the other side, those who wanted to support the opposition to sort of replace this regime with a more compliant one. Hence, the Friends of Syria that intervened in the name of Syrians, but really in the name of trying to pursue their own interest and potentially redraw the political map of the region in a way that is more suitable to their interests. That sort of competitive intervention, which took place because Syria is pivotal, was detrimental to the legitimacy of the uprising because it ended up transforming the uprising from one that was an uprising against brutal dictatorship into a power play, regional and international power play, to redesign, redraw the political map of the region, and perhaps even the territorial map, as we are seeing in Syria today, where its territorial integrity has been severely compromised. And this pivotal nature of the Syrian state invited the supporters of the regime who never claimed that they're trying to establish democracy in Syria. Iran, Hezbollah, Russia were supporting the regime so that the regime can be restored as is, as an authoritarian regime, the way it is, but also who played a role in the resistance axis with Iran and Hezbollah. So there were no pretenses there. The pretenses existed on part of those who came to support the uprising and the rebels, which early on was mostly a civilian movement and then was transformed into a more militarized uprising with very hardcore, I don't like the word extremist because of the way it's used in the United States, but hardcore elements that ended up actually transforming the uprising to something that is far more divorced from the initial sentiments of those who took to the streets early on. It was far more exclusive as opposed to inclusive, far more sort of closed than transparent, and far more responsive to external funding and external support than it was to what the majority of Syrians want, which affected, as we saw, the participation in the uprising, and people went to the streets as the sound of the guns and the bombs, mainly from the regime, but also from all sides, took over, and it became a non-civilian militant uprising that was dominated by groups that were, I don't like the word jihadist, I will not use it, but I use the word more totalitarian groups that became the spearhead of the uprising, even if others that are not of the same variety were participating at some level. And these are the people ultimately that were able today to rule Syria, nonetheless, with a transformation that they also underwent, which some people exaggerate, others completely dismiss, and I don't agree with either. And I think there was a transformation that produced the current form of HTS led by Ahmed al-Shari, whom we'll discuss in just a moment, I'm assuming. But I think it's more tenuous exactly what happened. So it does require some care. The point is that the dynamics, the junctures that were important throughout involved this competitive intervention that ultimately undermined the legitimacy of the uprising itself and produced a context within which Russia could intervene in 2015, and within a year and 3 months, by December 2016, completely tilt the balance towards the regime when the regime with the Russian support, were able to bomb the part of Aleppo, the western part of Aleppo, into submission, which was run by the rebels, in a way, end what is called the major hostilities in Syria. The reason I say end the major hostilities is not because there was no fighting afterwards, but that battle or that juncture in December 2016 ended this idea that the regime might actually fall. And what continued after that was basically, quote unquote, various local battles throughout to finish the job from the perspective of the regime in Russia and their supporters, Iran and Hezbollah. And from the other side, trying to sort of regroup and figure out how to proceed in a way that doesn't, as we saw today or in the past few months, doesn't completely eradicate their power, which is why they ended up ultimately being corralled or moved to Idlib under Turkish auspices. And after that moment in 2016, the two metropolitan cities that were the most important cities in Syria, Damascus and Aleppo, were completely under the regime's control, which is why the entry into Aleppo was the first target of HTS when they initiated their campaign in November 27, 2024. So all these stories tell us something about how international intervention, which is part of the objective of my current book on Syria, they tell us a lot about how international intervention has the capacity to undermine a totally and completely legitimate uprising or revolution against a bona fide repressive leadership, whatever its credentials in what is called the axis of resistance. And I don't support those who say it didn't play a role. And they say that because the regime itself didn't play a role directly, but it did play a role indirectly in the 2006 war with Israel by supporting Hezbollah and in other situations where it created a bridge between Iran and Hezbollah and so on and so forth. Whatever those credentials, and they are not as huge as people think, but they're also not non-existent as others think. Whatever its credentials, the regime had actually drew its own fate by only caring about itself, which is symbolized precisely by the manner in which the regime collapsed on December 8th. Its preoccupation with itself, with the top leadership, and maybe just a very small circle around it, became far more evident every single year, starting, in my view, in the late 80s and early 1990s. And by 2011, it got to a point where the only reason it was supported was because it was still seen as an effective partner. And then the reason that these same partners did not step in to repel, I would say relatively modest attacks early on by the HTS, because they were early on relatively modest. They themselves were surprised. The reason those allies who stepped in 2011 didn't step in 2024 is because the regime had lost all legitimacy by completely neglecting everything about their obligation as a state, starting right after the end of the control of what is called Syria al-Mufida, useful Syria, in 2018-19. And since then, the regime abrogated its responsibility completely, focused on itself, as we know, the amassing of capital and so on, which actually was taken with Bashar and so on. And that neglected the building or rebuilding of the army, neglected all sorts of infrastructural obligations that the regime had, and began to turn its own supporters, who supported it for 10 years despite all odds, against it, which is why the march of HTS throughout all of Syria, as well as the rebels from the south, because there are two or three different groups that ultimately took over. That was why it was a cakewalk. There wasn't even a resistance from the people that used to form militias to fight and defend the regime. So that is a picture that begins to set up the rotting that the regime has brought upon itself. And those who are upset that the regime is gone, from the perspective of the regime being part of a partnership and an axis that actually was the only thing that stood in the face of Israel and its genocide in Gaza and so on, those people should only the regime to blame for that. And the fact that it's gone, and the fact that most Syrians, if not all Syrians, have a sense of joy or at least relief, is something that should reassure everyone that this has been a positive development. Now, what happens next and what's happening today is a different issue.
Let me just step back a bit. It sounds like there was a key point in 2016 when it was clear, at least to the so-called anti-regime rebels, non-state actors, proxy groups, that the regime wasn't going to be overthrown. And then there seems to be another period you highlighted, which is 2018, 2019, where it sounds like it's cannibalizing itself almost, where the Syria al-Mufida, the useful Syria, which I would ask you to explain a little bit more, because if that was really the transition point that caused even the regime loyalists who had stuck by, right, Bashar Al Assad during these 5 violent years in Syria, is caused them to turn, is what is Syria al-Mufida or Suraya al-Mufida or Syria the Useful, and who is, you referenced HTS, and some, I suspect some people won't know who that group is, and you said there were 2 other key groups. Could you give us a little bit more info on those kind of key terms?
Yes, and I mean, that leads up to the discussion about how actually the regime fell. But Surya al-Mufida is just a term that was used actually within the within Syrian circles by the regime and its supporters, addressing the corridor between Damascus, Hama, Homs, Aleppo, and the northwestern coast of Latakia, Tartus, Banyas, and so on. And of course, it doesn't include the really Syria al-Mufida, which is the oil that now is under the control of the Kurdish factions and the United States in the northeast. And it simply refers to what the regime can be content with conquering, which is what it was able to restore to under its control. I don't like to use the word liberated, whether the regime does it or the rebels do it, because there's just so much baggage in those words. Not because things cannot be liberated, but because the people doing the liberation should also be judged by the extent to which they are acting and behaving and governing. For instance, when Raqqa was taken over by ISIS, and some people said it was liberated, and then you look at what's happening in Raqqa, it doesn't look like a lot of liberation in all cases. So there's that, and then there's the question of factions. Now, would you like me to talk about Ahmad al-Shara and HTS in
Yes, please range? Do. Yeah, he now appears to be the de facto Syrian president.
Actually,
Ahmad al-Shara. Yes, and also these other groups that you talked about, because I think it would probably be foolish of us to believe that the complexity is gone and then suddenly there's one winner. No. We now have to do a new analysis, right, of who are those key players, what has shifted, who's no longer on the chessboard, who are the new people, how have they transformed. So that would be a really helpful analysis, especially as we now gear into December 8th, 2024, starting as early as you think you should to understand that historic moment.
Yeah, that's a good way to set things up. I'll start by saying that the different groups that are now in control of different parts of Syria or have rebels or military, personnel or groups or militias, call them what you will, are several. The main group that actually is itself a coalition, which is HTS, that was housed or that made Idlib its starting point for several years, actually, from 2017-18 until today under Turkish auspices. That coalition includes various groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the main group, and Ahrar Sham, which is the second largest group after Jabhat al-Nusra. In Jabhat al-Nusra, which became Fath al-Sham, it went through various transformations, which are not insignificant. They are not too significant, but they're not insignificant. And I'm accused of being too nuanced. I mean, I don't know what to say about that. So the question is, who were these groups in Idlib? It was these 2 major groups and many, like literally a couple of dozen smaller groups and even more smaller factions. Those folks were ultimately not dominated by, but definitely led by Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahmad al-Shara, who used to be al-Jawlani before. Now he's Ahmad al-Shara, so let's call him Ahmad al-Shara. He just had an interview with The Economist in the past 24 hours, which is, doing the rounds, and it's very interesting what's coming out of this, and I'll address it in just a minute. Now, the other groups outside Idlib that actually participated in the uprising and had sort of different sorts of patrons throughout include the rebels in the south, in the province and city of Dir'a and beyond. You also have the Druze fighters in Sweda around that area, which actually it's the only place that experienced some sort of a mini uprising in the past few years, interestingly. Not because the others weren't willing, but I think the others were planning for something bigger, which now we learn is what had taken place. Because in the interview, Hamad al-Shara, but also in other, reports, we learned that this has been planned for several years, especially the last year, considering what was happening to those who would have been able to step in to oppose them. So in the past year, the opportunity became difficult to resist. Now, the other groups include the Free Syrian Army, although the Free Syrian Army, from almost the very beginning until today, is a very murky sort of, entity. It does have presence, it does have some weight, but it sort of comes in and out. Nonetheless, it is not something to completely dismiss, and we should consider it as part of the rubric of rebels that play a role. The reason I'm saying that is not just to enumerate and do a taxonomy, but also to share that all these groups outside HTS have not yet given up their arms, because they wouldn't do that until they figure out the nature of what is happening in Syria, until they figure out whether what's being promised is just rhetoric in terms of inclusion and so on, or is it more than that? The signs today, as I will discuss in just a minute, are not great for them because of what has been decided in terms of ministry cabinets, in terms of military leaders that included people from Egypt and China and various other places, but did not include these other folks who actually are not entirely happy about that. So this is why these groups actually are holding out. And these groups are not alone. These groups are vocal because they can be vocal because they actually have some power. And they are the ones who entered Damascus before HTS. The rebels from the south actually entered Damascus on the morning or the dawn, 5 a.m. specifically. Friends of mine were actually taking videos and pictures in Damascus at around 5 and 6 a.m. They entered Damascus before HTS reached Damascus. But by then, Mr. Assad had escaped Harab to Hmeimim military base in the northwest, the Russian military base, and then, of course, went to Russia. So that's the main reason. What I'm saying also is that these folks are supported, not in terms of who they are, because a lot of Syrians, and this is something that, can be debated, HTS and all these groups are not their dream leadership, but their dream is to get rid of the regime for the most part, for most Syrians. So whoever did it, given that they're Syrian, are going to be considered basically the people that they will have to work with, and some of them want to work with. That's not the point. The more important point is that many Syrians are looking at what's happening, and they are not as satisfied as they thought they would be at the moment that Bashar Assad disappeared from their lives, and the regime and the Ba'ath disappeared from their lives. And every day that passes provides people with a little bit more awareness as to the dangers ahead, and kind of justifies a lot of the apprehension that was experienced, because I call what happened in Syria the first month after December 8th apprehensive joy. People are joyful, but they're also apprehensive because of the way things happened, who was involved other than Turkey, what trade-offs were made, and how will this likely unfold on the ground in the future by a leadership that used to be Al-Qaeda affiliated and then says it was transformed. And it did, to an extent, not to the extent that a lot of people would like to believe, but it did transform to an extent. But as we have seen, that extent every day is being made clearer by the professions, statements, decisions, nominations, and appointments. And all of these point in a direction that is not positive. I'm not saying it's utterly negative. And the reason I'm not saying it's utterly negative, because they did manage, as a result of their discipline, to avoid a bloodbath in Syria. They did manage to be disciplined enough to prevent mass-scale killing and revenge throughout Syria, even though there are exceptions, and we have seen them. We have seen the executions, we've seen the treatment, but it's nowhere near what so many people feared would happen. And they would actually respect, even there are many stories about how they respected during the Christmas time, the joy of Christians celebrating and so on, in ways that were actually quite moving for the people who had always hated them. They were able to express that, no, this sanctity was protected, and so on and so forth. However, when it comes to the fine lines, as we have seen in several interviews, including this last interview with The Economist, where Ahmed al-Shara had the best opportunity and wanted to perform in a manner that would actually allay some of the concerns and fears of the West, as it were, we did see very timid answers regarding questions of Sharia, regarding questions of democracy, and regarding questions of inclusion, where he gave, timid to relatively vague answers, except that he did respond in a positive manner on these matters. But that approach is actually why people are very concerned about what's happening, because on the ground, as I shared, the appointments, the movements as in behavior of the new leadership, and the actual external relations tell another story, including the fact that the first head of state that visited Syria was a Qatari head of state. And the first head of state that Ahmed al-Shara visited was the Saudi head of state, or the the effective head of state, MBS. And that tells another story, even though if you look at the history of the uprising, and the two most ardent supporters of the uprising and the rebels and the funders of the rebels are those two states that were visited and that visited Syria. Not only so, but these two states, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in 2017, after the collapse or the takeover of Aleppo by the regime and its allies, had a public fight, literally a public fight in the media. And the beautiful thing about this is that it's on YouTube. And if they took it off YouTube, about 3 or 4 or 5 million copies have already been downloaded about the Qatari and the Saudi leaderships and their underlings exchanging insults and accusations as to who radicalized, militarized, and Islamicized the uprising to no end. And there is where you see the sorts of things that so many of us were writing in early on in 2012 and 2013, 2014, and we were called all sorts of names because we found that this is a suspect process that does not reflect the best interest of most Syrians and will not likely depose a repressive regime that can actually make use of what is being done to the uprising and what is being done to certain spearheads of the uprising that do not reflect the majority of Syrians in terms of where they would like to go, which we will find out in a short period. This is why Ahmed al-Shara is very concerned about using his words very carefully in order not to alienate many Syrians who are not exactly excited about the implementation of, for instance, al-Sharia in Syria, who are not excited about the sort of approach regarding gender relations, who are not very excited about what the constitution is likely to have and not have as precepts, and also are not excited about some of the plans that are made for the most important dimension here, which is economic development and economic revitalization, where al-Shara has been extremely direct about supporting a free market and inviting investments from everywhere. And the reason why thinking people don't like that is not because of the debate about free market and trickle-down economics versus something else. It's really about how dependence on this category of free market and external support and investment and funding from the Gulf and elsewhere means the further erosion of Syrian sovereignty, not just territorial sovereignty, but decision-making sovereignty and political economic sovereignty, which will leave most Syrians, just like it did in most of the developing world, by the wayside. So this is just a quick picture of all of this, but I skipped or I didn't address how the regime actually fell. And I can discuss this if you'd like, because it is quite instructive.
Yeah, no, I would like you to know, to explain those kind of instrumental or monumental 2 or 3 weeks. But one thing I also noticed when you explain that is to include Turkey. I didn't hear you talk about Turkey, and I've heard in the
That's why I want to talk about that.
Yeah, because I'm wondering to what extent, now that we know, in Qatar was the first head of state to be invited. Saudi Arabia is where Ahmed al-Shara went. And I'm sure Turkey also is very interested, or we know is very interested in the future of Syria for various reasons, whether it's the future of the Kurds, whether it's resources, whether it's expanding its own regional hegemony and competition with the Gulf states. So if you could elaborate on that, in addition to those instrumental 2 weeks, it sounds like it started in November 27th, and then very quickly Bashar was gone, and suddenly we have this de facto leader who used to be, or I'm not sure if the FBI has taken him officially off the designated terrorist list yet. It's February 4th, 2025 today during our conversation, but he certainly was a designated terrorist, and so was HTS, which again prompts many questions about U.S. foreign policy, which we'll get to next. But first, do tell us how this happened. How did this happen so quickly?
The reason I focused on Qatar and Saudi Arabia so far is because these are the ones that you are hearing about in the news. We don't hear very much about what's happening vis-a-vis Turkey, not because it's not influential, but I think because it is one of the major players. I don't want to say the ultimate decider, but it is definitely one of the major deciders in terms of what's happening in Syria. Not only because it was the one who must have given, or who did give, the green light for this to actually happen to begin with on November 27th, but also because Turkey is still in control of the majority of the northern border of Syria and is able to pull and mobilize, or is able to mobilize militant factions until today. Turkey is the guarantor of the safety of people in Idlib, and including the HTS and the communities that lived there and continue to live there to a significant extent. Turkey is a major player that is likely to not be in the forefront. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are definitely going to be two of the players that will participate in the process of rebuilding and investment, however that shape that takes, and whoever else is included, whether it's international financial institutions, whether it's, some Western powers and their protege IFIs, international institutions, and so on. The Qataris and the Saudis are likely to be involved. Now, the way this happened, and I've shared this several times, and we've read about it several times, is that as a result of the context where the allies of the Syrian regime were diminished in terms of their power, capacity, or in terms of their deterrence, right? Or in terms of their readiness to support Syria. When all of these factors were degraded in September, October, November, HTS recognized that this is the time to actually move. And this is not something that they decided on their own, because without Turkish support, they wouldn't have been able to do that. Now, the question is, when did they decide to actually basically carry out this operation? A lot of people say it's been a few years that they have decided or have been planning on this operation. However, more proximately, a lot of people shared that, or a lot of reports, and these are credible, that in the past year, there's been different times when this plan could have been carried out, but it was always delayed. And my sense is the delays are not just about HTS reading the room, which is, by the way, something that Bashar and the regime didn't read at all. They did not read the room at all. They failed so miserably, and I'll share why in just a minute, that they were taken by surprise to the point where Assad managed to escape just hours before people entered Damascus. The rebels entered Damascus. So I think the reason why this took place at the moment it did and things were delayed is not because HTS was trying to delay until the most opportune moment. I think there were conversations, agreements, deals made between the powers that be, including Turkey and other interlocutors in the region and outside the region, that actually determined when the green light would be given and on what basis and what the trade-offs were. And the main player here is Turkey. And a lot of people will tell you, oh, Turkey did this with the Americans and did that with the Israelis in an underhanded manner, and then had the Qataris on the side as a silent partner, which is not untrue, by the way, but they had this and that planned. And so the Saudis were not actually part of the plan, but then they entered. There's a lot of talk. But the definite fact is that Turkey gave the green light. There has been some coordination, which we don't know the content of, between Turkey and the United States, because the moment the United States was able to broker a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel is the moment that HTS moved. So waiting until that time is not just serendipity, nor HTS's genius, because it doesn't take genius. I mean, this was a good moment to actually carry out the operation, nor just Turkey working on its own. Especially if you look at what happened later. What happened later was that within 48 hours, the Israeli military was able to destroy more than 80% of Syria's military capacity without a word from HTS, without a word from Turkey, and without a word from the international community, which is extremely shameful. But that's a norm today. when it comes to destroying human beings and resources in the Arab world when it comes to Western responses and their allies. So what we're talking about is an Israeli operation that was definitely blessed by the United States, definitely known about by Turkey, and definitely accepted by HTS as a way to move forward without a hitch with whatever plan was carried out. Now, we can reconstruct that and pretend to know exactly what happened. I cannot do that. I can't, in all, honesty, in terms of intellectual and analytical integrity, say that. But we do know that these actions speak to a coordination that had taken place already that involves America, the United States as a full partner with Turkey, and Israel as a silent partner, because Israel usually doesn't intervene when it knows that somebody else is going to do the bidding, like with what happened with the Syrian regime on December 8th, just like it did not when the United States was fraudulently and barbarically invaded Iraq in 2003. Israel sat back because it knew somebody else was going to do the killing on its behalf, or that aligns with its interests. The point is that this takeover early on in Halab, in Aleppo, triggered the regime's attempts to request support from Russia, which happened to be direct because the Bashar was in Moscow and he was attending his son's PhD graduation in Moscow. Asked the Russian president, and these facts are facts because they've been reported by everyone and they were not denied by anyone. And they actually did make sense because Bashar is likely to ask the Russians for support. The support was not granted, and it remains to be seen whether or to what extent Assad shared the rejection of this request with everyone, or exactly who he shared this rejection of request. Some people say he didn't share it with anyone. Some people say he just shared it with a very close set of aides, but you can tell that some people were able to leave at the time that Bashar left and others didn't. So this speaks to the differential that I'm addressing. And when that support didn't come, and it was also requested of the Iranians, and it also didn't come, in the interim, the reason it didn't come from the Iranians is twofold. On the one hand, the Iranians actually also addressed Russia and they got the same answer, and they were not willing to go at it alone, which is, I think, the smaller answer. But the bigger answer is that Iran had already considered the Syrian regime a burden for several years now. The Syrian regime wasn't actually acting in a way that helped itself since 2018 and 19. It engaged in corruption. It engaged in narcotics trade to compensate for its loss of oil revenue. It engaged in all sorts of further austerity, not in the name of development, but in the name of siphoning off whatever capital and whatever resources it has. It completely neglected the development of the army as an institution, as an infrastructure. It did not pay its conscripts, it did not pay its soldiers, it did not pay its commanders enough for them to be able to survive. It ended up demoralizing the entire military institution, which is something that Iran is concerned with because it does not want to fight alone. In 2011, both were fighting. In 2024, it would have had to fight alone, especially after the cakewalk into Aleppo. Syria also hedged its bets by going to Saudi Arabia and the UAE in 23 and 2024, the arch enemies of Iran during the uprising that were actually the ones that were funding the rebels that were fighting the Iranians and the Syrians and Hezbollah in Syria, creating in the minds of Iranian leaders the notion that Assad is no longer reliable and is no longer worth the resources and the human lives that we would have to spend when he is not able to fight, his people are not able to fight for the regime, and is not likely to be as connected to the Axis as prior. And fourth, with Israel's aggression and genocide on Gaza and aggression throughout the region, again, continuing its decades of settler colonial presence and expansion and occupation and military occupation inside Syria, inside Palestine, and occupation of the Julan, created a situation where Iran was deterred not only from supporting Syria, because that was a consideration, but also from having Syria continue to be a bridge between Iran and Hezbollah. So all of the cards, all of the factors of the axis of resistance that would make use of Syria were diminished. So Syria was no longer either a prize or a bridge or a reliable player. So the Iranians didn't intervene. And they surely didn't want to start a war, another big war or back and forth with Israel at a time when Israeli deterrence proved effective. They didn't even respond to the last shelling and the last bombing of Iran, even after they promised they would a few months ago. So they're not going to start it if it's not the Syrian regime is not worth the fight. And of course, Hezbollah was in no position to act and to get out of Lebanon to help.
Let me just, I'm
like
sorry to interrupt you, but I think this is really fantastic analysis. This is the first time I've ever heard this critical perspective on Iran because, as you know, and you kind of mentioned it in passing, the analysis in the U.S. anyway tends to make it seem as if Iran needs Syria because it's crucial for its access to Hezbollah, which is then crucial for its attacks on Israel. This is one of the narratives, and to allow Syria to not be firmly within the sphere of influence of Iran is extremely risky, right? If the regime, notwithstanding its shortcomings that you very skillfully laid out, sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, and so it is intriguing that Iran would be willing to take that risk because there's a very high probability that the replacement of Bashar Al Assad, and this is yet to be, we don't know yet to be determined, will be anti-Iranian and will be anti-Hezbollah. And that would, of course, align perfectly with Israel's interests and U.S. interests and arguably even, the Gulf interests. So that factor is something that, to me, is a mystery. What do you think of that that angle of the Iranian-Syrian relationship?
No, I mean, historically, it was true. This is why the people that criticize this argument that Syria is not actually doing anything for resistance, they're right that it's not doing anything directly, but it's doing so much indirectly, including creating the only deterrence in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict through supporting Hezbollah in the 2006 war, which has angered and terrified the Israelis until 2024, by the way. So it's not true that Hezbollah or Syria is not doing anything. It is true that it's not doing anything directly. It's true that the Syrians have actually created the most peaceful border on earth in the history of humankind between Israel and Syria, because it wouldn't dare do anything, even as it is bombarded by Israel day in and day out for the past couple of decades. However, its enabling of resistance is not something that you can discard. At the same time, those who think Syria is going to make or break resistance, that's exaggerated, and certainly today. So historically, it's true that Syria played a role. In the future, it could have been true if the regime stayed afloat, especially in terms of actually not allowing an alternative to take place, an alternative that's complacent with Israel. So in that sense, it could be true. But at that moment, in 2024, in November, December, the regime was not worth the fight. That's why I disagree with everyone who says that, Iran was definitely not going to enter, or those who said Iran really wanted to enter, but just couldn't because the Russians weren't going to help. No, Iran was actually having its own problems. First of all, at home. Second, was deterred by Israel. Third, and most importantly, the Syrian regime demonstrated it's not worth the fight. Even when Iran tried for several years, along with Turkey, although for different reasons, to ask the regime to create some sort of national dialogue and try to reconcile with the opposition, which would have been very intelligent, by the way, even from a Machiavelli perspective, the Syrian regime and Bashar, who's known to be extremely obstinate, didn't respond to that and clearly was not leading the room, was not leading even anything. The Iranians had already resigned and began to think of Assad as a burden. At the same time, Iran has bigger things cooking, literally, and is trying to avoid an all-scale confrontation with Israel because it is waiting to produce the ultimate weapon, which may potentially be the only path to balance of power and therefore peace in the Middle East, maybe with some justice, a little bit more than we already have. So Iran has a different set of calculations because Iran, of course, when you hear the United States talk about Iran, United States as an establishment, or some of the people in the Arab world from a sectarian Sunni perspective, it's like when people talk about horoscopes to explain the world. It's so disconnected from reality. Clearly, Iran is not an angel. Clearly, it has its own problems, especially internally with its own people. And clearly, it's not, interfering just for the sake of, it's not like a Mother Teresa operation. Although I was told that I shouldn't mention Mother Teresa because there are things that came up about her that are not good. So I'll take that back. But Iran is certainly not what people are making it out to be, and certainly not worse than any of the people speaking about Iran, primarily the United States, in terms of their ability or their actual history of destroying the lives of hundreds of millions of people throughout the past several decades. So,
well, that's actually a great segue
Yeah.
into the kind of final part of our conversation, which is U.S. foreign policy, and specifically the Biden administration's foreign policy toward Syria, including its response
What administration?
or lack thereof. What was the Biden's administration?
Who's Biden? What's Biden? I'm joking.
It's a good joke. Towards Syria, including its response or lack thereof. And then how does this differ from Trump's foreign policy towards Syria during his first term and now beginning in his second term? In other words, what can we expect will occur in the next 1 to 2 years in Syria, and why, especially vis-a-vis the United States? And I'll just remind our listeners that today is February 4th, 2025. So there is a limit to how much we know about what to expect with Trump. But I think he has perhaps, given us some insights based on how he responded in 2016 to 2020. So what are your kind of preliminary thoughts there with regard to U.S. foreign policy?
To be brief, because I know I've outstayed my welcome, Biden's policy is a lame duck policy when it comes to Syria, especially in those last days. I am not even sure he was aware that these things were happening. I mean, I'm not entirely serious. But the Biden administration had ultimately, in terms of Biden himself, but definitely the effects of his desires and interests, was pegged on what Israel was doing at that moment, especially since October 7th. So in a way, what was happening meshed with the direction, which is basically the influencing the partners of Hezbollah in a negative way, that meshed with Biden's approach. It wasn't something that he even needed. Even if he was fully aware and fully functional and had an active policy, there was really not much that they could have said. Although what's being done under the table, which we don't know about, between Turkey and the United States, is something that really didn't require a lot of, presidential authority, because again, it meshed with the plans that were taking place in Gaza and the considerations for a regional political map that the US was looking to actually affect with a diminished Iran. So that's that. Obama did have a plan, actually, even though it was a passive plan. And Obama's administration, as we know from so many of the interviews and the pronouncements, besides actually, in a way, leading what can be called a very problematic war in Syria, even though people say, oh, the US didn't have actually much to do and wasn't ready to support the rebels to the limit. Of course they aren't, just like they did in Afghanistan, or they didn't in Afghanistan until the last minute, because there were, the different circumstances then. The point is that the US never considered Syria a prize. So it would only interfere very directly and powerfully in certain moments where the stakes are extremely high. The stakes never went that high. And the US was glad to be a part of the situation until today. We'll talk about Trump. Glad to be a part of the situation, engineering what it wants to engineer even before 2011. Of course, the CIA, from what we know from the WikiLeaks and so on, was always interested in creating and wreaking havoc in Syria, which a lot of people are like, oh my God, look what we discovered. What are you talking about? That's what we do. That's what the United States does. That's what we did in Iran in 1953. And that's what we've done in the early 50s. And when we deposed the democratically elected leader and installed the Shah, which gave us ultimately, Mabruk, congratulations, the Islamic Revolution in 1979, because of how horrible the Shah was for so many years. The point is that the Biden administration was basically cruising, following basically the cues of its own policy in the region based on the primacy of Israel's interests and quote unquote Israel defending itself. Because what happened, the collapse of the regime, moves in the same direction, and it was something that it supported. However, there was no will. If he even had another year, there was no will to do what Trump is planning to do. And you asked about Trump. Trump is not excited about war. We know that. Those who hate Trump and hate everything he does don't see some of the, I'm not saying positives, but just just don't see the reality of what Trump has actually done or not done in the region when he was president and today. He doesn't like war, but the reality is, the truth is that Trump is not excited about spending resources for things outside the US. It's not just like he's anti-war and anti-violence. He's not a pacifist and like a Zen guy. He just doesn't want to spend money on things outside the United States if he can afford it. If he cannot, or if it touches his sort of credibility as a male, in my view, I mean, that's my view, he will actually, launch a small nuclear missile if he has to. But that's a different issue. He believes in, basic classical realist balance of power material or stuff that he has learned over the years, not in the first term so much, but now. And he'll interfere only when he has to. But otherwise, he wants to pull out. He wants to pull out of Syria. And he's actually discussed this. And the issue is that when he says that, people say, what are you going to do about the Kurds? Well, it's not like the United States was there for the Kurds, nor was it in South Iraq in the early 90s because of the Shia population. In fact, it really betrayed the Shia population and allowed Saddam Hussein to kill tens of thousands of Shias in the South when it felt that it's time to get out, or it's not going to continue the invasion and actually take out Saddam Hussein in 1991. The same here. It's likely to actually gradually get out. I don't know what it will do with the fact that it was and has been stealing Syrian oil and benefiting from it for itself or for its allies or for the gravity of its presence there. But the Trump administration is likely to diminish its presence, barring some developments. And we are likely to see that vacuum, which was created by the absence of Iranian and Hezbollah presence in Syria that was occupied by Turkey. We now see that Turkey will actually have a bigger share of authority in Syria if the US pulls out. And already Ahmed al-Shara has gotten affirmations, as well as others have gotten affirmations, that Syria will not be a launching pad for the Kurdish Workers' Party that Turkey fears so much. So there must be some coordination taking place between the new Syrian government, Turkey, and the United States. And I would argue the SDF, the Syrian Defense Forces that are working with the Americans, the Kurdish parties that are working with the Americans, so that if this does happen, that there is some sort of formula. I don't know what it is. Some people claim they know what it is. And the internet is full of such claims and such theses. I don't know where these people get their confidence from.
That is a lot to think about. And I appreciate your nuance, Bassam, and I appreciate the level of complexity that you bring to this really already complicated topic and how you problematize these issues, because one of the many shortcomings of U.S. foreign policy or Middle East analysis in the United States is that it tends to be very black and white. It tends to be not rooted in the realities of the people and the complex realities and different realities or experiences of the people in the region. And it tends to be outcome determinative, right? Rather than more truth-seeking and fact-based and letting that lead the analysis. So I think that your perspective is so crucial. I wish that our U.S. foreign policy apparatus was more appreciative of your perspective and others who have a much deeper understanding of the Middle East than those who are formally responsible for developing U.S. Middle East policy. But hopefully with time, maybe that can change. Before we just end, do you have any closing thoughts or closing remarks?
First, thank you so much. I appreciate the nice words very much. And despite the fact that I could be wrong on a number of counts, I'm actually at least not willing to venture into territory I cannot defend in terms of evidence and so on. I'd like to say something about you, because you mentioned in your in the last question something about where might we be going or where might this lead. My concern about Syria, as somebody who's half Syrian, right? My mother's family is from Syria and I have friends and family in Syria. And the concerns of people that I know in Syria, and they are split between those who are, happy with few reservations and those who are happy with a lot of reservations. Because I don't know anybody who's not happy, even the former supporters of the regime, or not actually supporters of the regime, those who stood on the side of the regime against the uprising and how it developed, are actually glad that the regime is behind them, hoping for something better, but they're apprehensive about that. My concern, based on what I hear from everyone and based on my study of Syria for the past 31 years now, is that it's going to be ravaged by external influence. And that is not necessarily a very horrible thing, not because it's not bad in and of itself, but because we have to keep in mind what Syria has gone through for the past several decades, and the extremely, extremely low bar that was set by the regime in the past several decades, plus the misery of the past 14 years or 13 years of uprising and killing of more than 500,000 people, mostly by the regime and its allies, but also significantly in the second degree by the opposition and its allies, because they also claimed the lives of more than 100,000 people, at least. Some people say a lot more, but we do know that from records of, regime fighters, militias, and civilians in the regime areas. The point is that this external influence, no matter how horrible, is not going to lead to a situation where, in my view, that at this moment is going to outweigh the kind of misery that a lot of people felt the past 13 or 14 years, especially. Not forget even the several decades, which can actually be added to the misery, the recent misery, and is the bed of it. But it's not likely to be a pretty sight. And in my view, what we want to watch for is the extent to which the new leadership, which is not planning on having serious elections or constitution for 3 to 4 years, by that time they would have done what the Israelis did in the West Bank, so to speak, build material conditions on the ground that will that will obviate certain conclusions. Their ability to convince social forces by this new formula inside Syria that the rhetoric that they have, the one of inclusions and rights and so on, is real. So we need to watch for that, the ability for them to be able to convince others, especially those holding arms on the one hand, and Syrians who are likely to begin forming groups and organizations or revitalize them in order to do to the current formula what they did to the previous formula in some way. And the external players are not going to have a problem, I think, in many ways, with so much of the infringements of the new formula, the new regime, the new leadership, the new president, unless it actually shuts them out. So long as it's compliant to them, they're going to be okay with it. My concern is about Syrians and whether they're going to be able to believe and feel that the process is legitimate, especially regarding inclusion, revitalization of the economy, and rights. And the other part is actually very much about the economy and whether the new leadership is going to be able to revitalize the economy without seriously compromising the well-being of most Syrians who are under the poverty line, either by not providing them with opportunities or by opening the door for all sorts of players and actors internally and externally who will be able to develop Syria, but at the expense of the majority, just like the Assad regime did prior.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.